Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Today we're talking with Michael Patton. Michael is an avian biologist with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. Hi, Michael. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thank you for talking with us today.
Thanks for having me, Shannon.
Oh, happy to have you. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation because bluebirds are many people's favorite, or if not their favorite, it's high up on their list of favorites. But before we dive into talking about bluebirds, why don't we take a couple of minutes to just tell everyone a little bit about who you are and what you do?
My name is Michael. I'm an avian biologist with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. My main duties are monitoring peregrine falcons, looking at their population, and just trying to make sure that it's increasing over time as it has been. I'm also interested in loggerhead shrike, maintaining that population size. I'm also the falconry coordinator for the department, so I issue permits so people can go out and hunt with different raptors.
Very interesting. Yeah. And I might have to have you back on again sometime in the future, talk more about loggerhead shrikes and peregrine falcons and some of these other cool things.
Yeah, I'd love to.
But yeah, today we wanted to really talk a lot about the bluebirds because, like I said, they're a favorite for so many people. And many places they're a relatively common backyard bird anymore. And I mean, they're just interesting. Plus, I know you've done a lot of research recently with them. So we want to dive into all of that. But I'm thinking before we go too much further, we should probably stop and recognize the fact that in North America, there's 3 different species of bluebirds.
Right.
But here in the eastern part of the continent, and you're in Kentucky, I'm in Kentucky, most of our listening audience is in the eastern part of the US or in eastern parts of Canada. We've got a few listeners I know of that are further west because they've written me and talked to me and stuff. But when you and I say bluebird, we're talking the eastern bluebird because that's our only option for the eastern half of the continent.
Right.
So yeah, some of our listeners who are further west, we're not necessarily talking the same bluebird as you have.
Yeah, they're most likely thinking about the western bluebird or the mountain bluebird. They're all different species.
But since we only have one species, we tend to just say bluebird.
Yes.
Yeah, some of what we talk about may or may not apply to other species. Yeah, let's just start off with some of the basics. Can you tell us some of the general eastern bluebird biology and life history?
Yeah, sure. So eastern bluebirds, they're a small thrush. They're between the size of a sparrow and a robin. Give you kind of an idea of how large they are. Males are vivid deep blue above, and kind of like a rusty reddish orange on the breast and throat, and they have kind of a white below on the kind of belly. Females a little bit more drab, as birds usually tend to be. They're more grayish above. They're kind of that brighter bluish wing and tail as well, and they have a more of a subdued orange on the breast. They're a secondary cavity nesting species, so they don't actually create their own cavities to lay eggs in or nest in. So they'll utilize either just naturally occurring cavities or like cavities that have been produced by other species like woodpeckers. They'll actually use those to lay their eggs in. They're thrushes, so they're related closely to like our American robins or our hermit thrushes or wood thrushes. They're all that same family. That family is called Turdidae. They're also very closely related to those other bluebirds we were just talking about, the western and mountain bluebirds. They actually fall inside the same genus, Scialia. It's hypothesized that the western and eastern bluebird actually diverged. They're the same species at one point. They diverged about 2.45 million years ago during the late Pliocene. So it's been a while, but at one point, they were the same species. So the West Coast and East Coast could kind of come together with that, I guess.
Very interesting.
Mostly eat insects. About 70% of their diet's made up of insects. 30% made up of fruits from, different native plants. We talk about how they're both, robins and eastern bluebirds are thrushes. They're in that same family, but they have really different styles of foraging. Where you think of a robin in your backyard, typically it's going to be on the ground, kind of rummaging around, flipping over leaves and stuff, looking for insects that way. Eastern bluebirds have a hunting technique called hawking, where they're going to sit on top of a perch of some sort, and they're going to look around with pretty good eyesight. And they'll actually see the prey that they want to eat, and they'll fly down, grab it, fly back to their perch or back to their nest to feed their young.
Nice.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was some of the stuff that I was wanting to talk about, was what do they eat and all that stuff. But habitat wise, they're not one that you're going to find out in the woods. They're more of the open fields type areas.
Yeah. So like historically, their habitat was most likely like a type of more of a savanna habitat or kind of short grassland with intermittent trees. Nowadays, you're going to see them more pastures, agricultural fields, suburban parks, backyards, golf courses, places, that kind of replicate that savanna, but it's more just mowed lawns, mowed areas or just short pasture fields, like I said, where, there's not too much cover. It's kind of what you're looking for their habitat.
Right. And I know back several decades, there was a huge decline in eastern bluebird numbers, and a lot of emphasis was put on putting out the bluebird boxes and doing some of those things. What are they like now?
So now they're doing really well. Like you're talking about, early 1900s, their population was declining significantly. And that was due to a large part of the introduction of European starlings, house sparrows, that they were just directly competing with the bluebirds for, cavities, right? They are all cavity dwelling species. So they were just driving them out, populations plummeted. In the 1960s, bluebird trails got really popular. So people were putting bluebird boxes out in their backyards or in the country along country roads, stuff like that. And in doing that, they also kind of figured out there's a certain diameter pole size that European starlings can't fit through, the bluebirds can. And that actually opened up a lot more habitat for the eastern bluebird. And it's just been a miraculous recovery since that was initiated.
Yeah. Okay. And with the bluebird houses, obviously those are the nesting cavities for them, or are serving as artificial nesting cavities for them. But one of the things that I've always thought was really interesting, especially with birds, this is going to play into some of your research as well, is learning about the nesting and breeding behaviors of the different species, because depending on what species of bird you're talking about, it is so different and can be really interesting. So with the bluebirds, they pair up and they're what's called socially monogamous. So you have one male and one female as a pair that are raising the young in the nest. And in the bluebird, eastern bluebird case, both parents are contributing to raising the young.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So both of them are at least going to be feeding the young.
Okay.
Females obviously contribute a lot more, but
yes, exactly. But the male helps to feed. It's the female does all the incubation. The male's helping to feed her while she's on the nest, and then also with the young as well once they hatch.
Right.
But with many birds, what appears to be true and what we used to think was always true with them being monogamous and one male, one female, we found that with DNA research and being able to do some of the genetic testing on the young, we found that with various species, there's quite a bit of cheating sometimes on both sides, or either side or both sides, depending on, again, the species. What about bluebirds? How much do they cheat on each other, or how much is that social monogamy also genetically monogamous?
So for eastern bluebirds, they are socially monogamous, but they're definitely not always faithful to one another. So it's not a huge percentage of the time that it happens, but there's definitely a lot of instances of inside of the same brood, you're going to have, half siblings, right? Different fathers, sometimes even different mothers, where female come lay an egg and another female's nest. They might have the same father, different mothers. It definitely happens. I think it's less than 10% of the time, if I'm remembering my fact correctly there.
Yeah, I always think it's interesting because like some species, it's like you're saying with eastern bluebird, it happens, but not very often.
Right. And then some species, it happens quite a bit, to the point where it's advantageous to have as much genetic material as possible in your brood, right? It increases the chance that your offspring are going to survive.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And sometimes it's happening more, from what I've read with the research, sometimes for some species, it's more it's a different father, and sometimes it's a different mother. Just, again, it depends on the species. And then it's relatively rare, at least in songbirds, for there to be practically zero cheating on it or unfaithfulness with it. Carolina wren's the only one I know of that is pretty much faithful completely.
I think so. I think you're right there. I mean, you think about the other way too. Like, look at like the phalaropes, where female's going to come in, she's going to lay eggs, and then the father's going to take care of it, and then she's going to go lay eggs with another male. She's just trying to maximize the reproductive output with as much different genetic material as possible. I mean, it's really cool, like, all these different strategies to try to just increase the fitness of your offspring.
Yes, exactly, which is why I've always thought it was such an interesting concept once I found out about it and started studying it. And then also with the nesting behavior, from what I've read, the eastern bluebird, the coloration of the male helps the female decide which ones are going to be more fit and helps her choose the mate.
Right. Yeah. So with that, plumage is, it's the ultimate signal in birds, right? That's the first thing that we notice as humans, and it definitely plays into what the birds are noticing with one another, obviously. And you think you can take all that energy that you would use just to survive and put it into your feathers and be more brightly colored, which is going to make you more attractive to predators, not just your mate, right? It's a danger to you. You can say, I have this much energy to spare. My genes are that good that I'm going to pass these on to your offspring, and then they're going to be good to pass on your genes to further generations.
Yeah, exactly. How many broods do eastern bluebirds typically have?
So typically, it's going to be between 1 and 4, at least kind of in mid-southern United States.
Mm-hmm.
The higher you go northern latitudes, it's going to just be 1. And the further you go south, like down in Florida, Nicaragua, it's going to be 1 again. But kind of in that sweet spot, Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania area,
Mm-hmm.
it could be up to 4.
And how do they choose whether they have 1 brood or 3 broods or 4 broods?
So that's what I was investigating with my research. And we were just trying to figure out what factors essentially determined how many broods a pair would have in 1 year. And I can just kind of give you a little bit of background about my whole entire project if you want.
Sure.
Okay. So like I said, I was looking at those different factors that contribute to the variation in the number of broods that, these pairs were having. My project actually took place at the Bluegrass Army Depot outside of Richmond, Kentucky. That Army Depot is a munition and chemical weapon storage and disposal facility that's owned by the United States Army. There's over 5,100 acres of land that's just grazed by cattle, so it's perfect bluebird habitat.
Mm-hmm.
And on that, in that acreage, there's 71 eastern bluebird boxes, so just prime for a study like that I had. What I did is I would go out there early March, and I would start looking to see, where these nests are starting to pop up. So essentially the factors we were looking at were the date that the first egg was laid, so that kind of that clutch initiation date, the number of eggs that were laid, how many nestlings would actually hatch from those eggs, and then the provisioning of the parents, kind of more specifically male provisioning. There's these hypotheses, the enhanced fecundity hypothesis and the load lighting hypothesis, that it's essentially if the male can take enough burden off of the female early on, she may be able to have better luck with later reproductive acts. So she may be able to lay more eggs later in the season. So that's kind of what we were looking at with that, increased male provisioning.
Okay.
So kind of my methods, I started early in March, just kind of looking for that nest initiation. So once we knew where the nest was going to be, I could go out there every week and just look to see when eggs were being laid. And once we had all of our eggs in there, I'd be out there every other day looking for the hatching of the eggs. So a lot of time spent at the depot early on in the season. So once the eggs actually hatched, we knew how many nestlings we had. We would just kind of leave them alone until the nestlings were 7 days old. And then we would actually capture the parents using mist nets, and we would equip them with unique color band combinations on their legs. So just different colors, so we can tell them apart later, as well as a USGS aluminum band, which is used for, if that's recovered, we age the bird, a whole bunch of different information once they're recaptured. And then during this whole entire time frame, we had these plastic containers set up on either pieces of wood that looked at the nest boxes, or some of the nest boxes actually had these containers drilled into the back of them. And we would place cameras in there, and the cameras would actually record the male and the female coming back and forth with different food items. And we would set those up for, an hour and a half every day or every other day, depending on how many nests we had going at the same time. We only had so many cameras. We couldn't have 20 cameras all at one time. That was way beyond my budget. Mm-hmm. So we're, setting these cameras up, and they were recording the different provisioning from the adults. And that was going to be used to determine that kind of that load lighting hypothesis, or, also look at the size of the prey items that the parents were bringing, so we could determine, if that actually impacted how many broods that they were having in a single breeding season. So during that, we're keeping track of the cameras, we're keeping track of, how many of the young are actually successfully fledging from nest boxes, how much predation is taking place. So then after that, we'd go back through and we had to watch all this footage and, try to determine which of these factors were actually impacting the number of broods. So at the end of the season, determined that we had 39 pairs that just had 1 brood, We had 34 pairs that had a second brood and 8 pairs that had 3 broods total. So a lot of nests.
A lot of nests, yes. Yeah. A lot of videos and a lot of nests.
Yeah, a lot of review time, most definitely. So and then we did an analysis once we went through all the footage and determined all of the different provisioning rates and food item size. What we found is that the mean clutch size varied with brood number. So the first broods, ones just had 1 brood, they would just stop after having 1 set of chicks. They were done for the year. They actually had significantly more eggs in their clutches than pairs that would have 2 or 3 broods in that same breeding season.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about it, it makes sense. I'm only going to have 1 set of chicks or 1 clutch in that breeding season. I'm going to just try to pump out as many eggs as possible, right? Just have as many offspring as I can.
Yes.
Whereas if I think I can have 2 or 3, I don't have to put as much effort into that. I'm going to double or triple my full amount of reproductive output at the end of the year.
Mm-hmm.
But what was interesting, though, is when we actually looked at how many eggs had hatched and how many successfully fledged, they were all equal, at the end. So it seems that even though those first broods had a larger number of eggs, either all of them, some of them were predated, some of them just didn't hatch, all ends up kind of being equal at the end. Provisioning rates, though, that was kind of my favorite part. It's the most interesting thing I got from my project. What we found is that males that would go on to have 3 broods at the end of the nesting season,
mm-hmm.
they were actually contributing much more during their first brood than other birds that had just 1 brood or 2 broods during the breeding season. So early on, they were maximizing their output. So they're allowing the female, and their pair to just, kind of take it easy, rest up, kind of preserve your energy for the rest of the breeding season. You got a long road ahead of you, essentially. So it really just supported that, load lightening hypothesis that they might have an idea how many broods they might have in the breeding season, so that they can kind of just save their energy up and make sure that works out for them.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But so for the ones that only had 1 brood, were the males provisioning just as much for that 1 brood as they were for, say, the males that were having multiple broods throughout the season?
So what we found is that during the first one, like I said, let's say you have just 1 brood in your breeding season. That's all you're going to have.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have another individual that's going to have 2 broods in that breeding season. They were both provisioning at the same rate throughout the whole entire time.
Okay.
And then even birds that were going to have 3 broods during the breeding season, during their second brood were provisioning at the same rate as those that were having their second brood. But those individuals that would go on to have 3 broods during the first one of the year, they were maximizing their provisioning rates. So just so that the females didn't have to provision as much. But we're also, we looked at essentially comparing the males and the females for each day of a nest.
Mm-hmm.
Where you have early on, you have the males are contributing much more than the females, and that tends to taper off later. Early on, the females are incubating, the young, so we got to keep them warm, right?
Right.
So that she's not able to go out and get food nearly as often. So we can see that, if you look at it over time, male starts off provisioning really, really high, and it just tapers off as it goes on. It's the exact opposite of the female.
Yeah, and that makes sense, though.
Yeah, right.
And what's the normal clutch size?
So clutch size, it's going to be anywhere between 2 and 6, and I think the mean is around 4, and that's going to be variable. I believe, like I said, higher latitudes, you want to maximize reproductive output. So you're going to have much larger clutch sizes. And by much larger, I mean maybe 1 extra egg, but it's significant.
Right. But I mean, an egg's pretty good investment in energy there. So that's
exactly.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of energy to produce an egg, right? And keep it warm, feed it later, right?
Right, exactly. So even 1 can be significantly larger.
We were talking about looking at prey size between, what the parents were bringing. And ultimately, that didn't differ at all between how many broods they had, male and female. There's no difference whatsoever. And part of that, I think, is just how large the young's mouths are, right? You can't feed, a small little nestling something that's gigantic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be constrained. There's the gate size constraint hypothesis. Essentially states you can't feed your young something that's too large for their mouth. And that's exactly what came into play there.
And again, I mean, that makes sense. You can only cram something so big down a hole that's little bitty.
And I feel like a lot of it was just reinforcing, well, this is perfectly logical. We just need to make sure it's not playing a factor.
Right, exactly. Because sometimes we look at something and say, well, that makes sense. And then we actually go through and test it and it doesn't do what we thought it did at all. So always got to go back and look at stuff.
Right. And it took very little time just to make sure.
Right. How long do they stay a nestling?
So they will stay a nestling. They typically fledge about 18 to 19 days, and that's going to change, where you are located, latitudinally.
Mm-hmm.
The area that I did my research, around Kentucky, is going to be about 18 to 19 days, and that seems to be, at least from my observations, anecdotally speaking, pretty much a rule. They typically didn't wait much longer or fledge earlier than that.
You may not know this, and I don't know if there is an answer yet to this. This might be one of those scientific I don't know questions. But with that wiggle room on the fledgling time, is that due to, say, temperature? So they need to be warm longer, so they have to be incubated longer and just kind of spreads it out that way? Or is it more of the finding enough food and bringing the food back? Or what's controlling that wiggle room?
That's a great question. And to be honest with you, I don't have the whole answer. If we want to take a step back in time, we can look at like eggs, and temperature is going to play a much larger impact with eggs, right?
Mm-hmm.
When it's colder, you're going to have a larger time of incubation, so they're not going to hatch as early as until it's warm.
Right.
During the summertime, you're going to have shorter egg incubation because it's warm outside. As far as with the actual nestlings themselves, I'm not entirely sure. Part of it's going to be, I'm sure, temperature to some degree. It's going to require the female to spend less time on them, incubating them early on before they can develop their down a little bit and be able to warm themselves. And if she's able to adopt them a little bit earlier, she can help get food, feed them a little bit, and that's going to maybe increase their fitness to be a little bit better off, a little higher fat reserves. But it takes time to grow all the feathers they're going to need, so that's going to probably be that limiting factor, more so than the actual food itself. To be honest with you, it's going to be one of those things that I'm not going to have an answer for.
And that's perfectly okay. I never really thought about it. I mean, I always see those time spans, and I never really thought about it until we were just talking, and I was like, wait a minute, what causes the span? Or is it just general genetic differences like with people? I mean, some of us mature a little bit faster than others and hit our growth spurts faster. So is it just something like that?
Yeah, it's probably something like that. Yeah, I'm sure there's hundreds or thousands of factors that are contributing to that difference between 18 and 19 days. Right.
Right. But yeah, I mean, like I said, it was just one of those things that suddenly popped into my head. I was like, I wonder if there's an answer that I don't know about. So if people want to try and encourage having bluebirds in their yards or around their houses, what are some of the things that you would suggest doing?
Yeah, so I would just say you need to provide habitat for them. It's going to be the number one thing. You want to have, kind of replicate that savanna to some degree. You don't want too many, trees in your yard. If you have a forested backyard or something like that, your farm has a large timber lot, you're probably not going to have much success attracting bluebirds. You want to, like I said, replicate that savanna. You want short grass, some bare ground. You're going to have shrubs and even trees scattered throughout, but they shouldn't be the majority of the habitat. You also want to make sure there's food, right? So eastern bluebirds are mostly insectivores, and so you have to have insects on your property, and that can just be planting native plants, native trees, things that are going to attract those insects. You also need to make sure that you have cavities, right? So that can be nest boxes, or that can be naturally occurring things like snags, dead trees, that just have those naturally occurring cavities. I would also say I came across this website, it's sialis.org. So it's like a specific epithet of species of bluebird. And they have a whole list of native plants and all the different things. They have them all flagged for different hardiness zones. So if you're in Canada or if you're in Kentucky, they have the things that you could plant in your backyard or on your property. And they have, whether or not bluebirds have actually been documented eating these things. But it's, reinforces that these are actually going to be used by these bluebirds for themselves or for their young. It's just a really neat resource that I came across.
And talking about the insects and the foraging, and that brought me back to another question. What do they mostly eat? I mean, is it mostly like grasshoppers and little flying thingies, or more caterpillars, or even more into the arachnids with the spiders and stuff?
So in short, it's all of those. From my research, it was a lot of Lepidoptera larvae. It's a lot of caterpillars, different, small wriggly things, a lot of like grubs. Occasionally there'd be grasshoppers, occasionally there'd be, flying insects. But for the most part, it seemed like it was small caterpillars. occasional arachnid, but that definitely wasn't the norm.
And I'm assuming with the small caterpillars, I'm guessing that a lot of those are probably more like inchworm type moth caterpillars and not like big giant swallowtail butterfly caterpillars or anything.
For the most part, it's smaller things, but occasionally we'd have things that were surprisingly large, like 60 millimeters long, which is, way too large for any nestling. But parents would come and they drop a nest for them.
Mm-hmm. And I always like to point out too, because I know a lot of people like to have the butterfly gardens and stuff like that, that having the birds out there that are eating the caterpillars is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's all part of the ecosystem. There are way more caterpillars out there than the ecosystem could possibly support all of them making it to adulthood. So it's built into the system to have this predation going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
I actually like the predator-prey relationships and think those are really interesting. So as long as it's balanced and everything's good,
yeah,
it's not a bad thing at all. You can have it all.
And it has to happen. If you don't have it, you don't have bluebirds, right?
Right. So we were talking about the cavities, and we can have either natural ones, dead snags, dead trees and stuff, limbs that have those natural cavities in them, where it's safe to leave them. Obviously, it's not always safe in our human-built environments to have dead trees hanging around, but they can provide great habitat where we can do it safely.
Right.
And then also we can have those bluebird boxes. What are some of the tips that you might give somebody who wants to put out a bluebird box?
So there's tons of different plans online for Eastern bluebird boxes. For the most part, some are better than others, but more or less, I'm sure they're all equal. I'm sure there's plenty of websites will point you in the right direction. Generally speaking, though, when you're placing your bluebird box, you typically want to have it about 4 to 5 feet off the ground. It's been suggested, and there's been some research into it, that like a wooden 4x4 and a wooden post is much more preferred than like a metal galvanized steel pole by the actual bluebirds themselves. They'll actually pick boxes that are on wooden posts.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a large piece of property, you can have more than one bluebird box on your property. That's not a problem. A bluebird's territory is about 5 acres, so it's pretty large for the size of the bird.
Mm-hmm.
But generally speaking, if you put one nest box within 100 yards of the nest box, you could have 2 pairs that are in that same area, right? Anything closer than that, they're going to be kind of competing for territories. You might have some unhappy bluebirds, to put it lightly. So if you are trying to attract more than one pair to your property, you space them out enough. You can put 2 to 3 boxes next to each other. You're going to have one pair that's going to be in that area, though. But it could be a nice little test to see, maybe I have 3 different types of bluebird boxes next to one another. You can see, which type is the best for my local bluebirds, at least. When you're putting them on those poles, you can also kind of have a baffle. So that's going to decrease predation. It's some people have these cones that come across, so like snakes can't work their way up the pole, or raccoons or squirrels can't climb it. Some people will simply take like a 5-gallon bucket, drill a hole in it, and just put it on the pole. It can be that easy. For my research, we were actually using those galvanized steel poles that we're not supposed to. But we would just take marine grease and we would grease the entire pole, and that just made it hard enough for predators to climb up it. So that's something just as simple as that works as well. You can actually also make, they're called hull predator guards. You have to think like a hallway into the nest box. So this makes it so, if a raccoon or a cat gets on your nest box, it can't actually reach as far into the hole and grab the nestling, which is kind of increasing that area. Sometimes they're made of chicken wire. Sometimes people make them out of wood or PVC. There's tons of different plans online. But those things it's going to increase the chance of survival of the young and the adults too. It just kind of makes them a little bit safer. And like I said earlier, you want to make sure that your hole is 1.5 inches in diameter. Any larger than that, you're going to increase the chance of starlings coming into your nest box and occupying it. Starlings, house sparrows, are the mortal enemies of eastern bluebirds. It's a little harder to exclude the house sparrows. There's different things online. I think some people will put a monofilament like fishing line kind of strung on the outside of the bluebird box. And apparently just the movement of the fishing line is enough to scare off the house sparrows. I don't know how well it works. You can't say it's going to work every time. I don't know. If you do try this out, just make sure you're keeping an eye on it. You don't want that monofilament to get inside the cavity where it can use the nesting material. Leads all sorts of problems with the nestlings. If you're just trying to attract bluebirds, so you need food, right? You can't have habitat without food. They're not going to come to like your regular like bird feeder, your finch feeder, your sunflower seeds. That just won't interest them. People will put out mealworms, like dry mealworms, like a platform feeder. They sell specialty bluebird feeders. That's the stuff that they're going to come to. They generally won't come for seeds.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, planting native plants is a great way, not just get bluebirds, but a host of other different species of native, fauna out to your property. But fruiting plants, most of their diet is made of insects, but 30% or more is made up of those fruits. If you're trying to attract them, might as well plant something that's going to help everyone else too.
Yes, exactly.
I think it's worth mentioning that, when eastern bluebirds are eating these seeds and these berries and stuff, they're also dispersing those seeds. Without them, there'd be a much shorter range. If we didn't have them actually taking the seeds, eating them, digesting them, and then defecating a mile away. That's how the plants are actually moving around, right? That's how you get these different populations of species of plants that might be, without them, just have one little area and would eventually go extinct when that area, has a bad, ice storm or something, right?
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. We forget sometimes their importance as dispersers in the case of the bluebirds, which are mainly berry eaters for the vegetation that they eat and spreading those seeds around. Or in the case of some of our other songbirds that may be more seed eaters, just spreading those seeds and helping to, like you said, get those plants out into the environment and dispersed throughout the ecosystem. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing.
Yes. Unfortunately, there's a huge amount of invasive species of plants. And that honeysuckle bush that's with those bright red berries looks pretty tasty. I'm sure that they're going to grab those. And that's how these invasives spread, right? It's just how it goes.
Right, exactly. And when do the bluebirds eat the berries mostly? Are they mainly eating them during the winter when there aren't as many insects, or are they kind of spreading it out throughout the year, that 30% of their diet?
So during the breeding season, they're going to be mostly eating insects when there's lots of larvae around. It's easy pickings. When you get to the point where there's not as many insects around, that's when they're really going to be going towards more, seeds, berries, things like that. And this is like those leftover dried bits on the plant that no longer look appetizing to us at all, right? We should eat them anyways, but they don't look, bright red and juicy. But that's what's getting them through the winter, right? Without that, we wouldn't have bluebirds.
So I would say, as we're planning our gardens and stuff, and if attracting bluebirds is one of the things that we want to do, it's not just planting plants that are going to have berries at any time of the year. This is another one of those situations where we want to make sure we have plants that are going to have berries later into the winter and kind of hold on to that fruit more.
Yeah, definitely. And and it's also not cutting it down at the end of the year when it no longer looks pretty. Those areas where there's some grass and stuff, that also provides cover for winter insects, right? And then birds will go in there and actually find those insects. They're much better finding them than we are. So without that cover, there's no insects, there's no birds. It's just trying to keep that habitat year round.
Right. Yes. With so much, that's really the important thing, is providing that year-round habitat.
Absolutely.
And well, we just said year-round habitat. Bluebirds are short distance migrators, correct?
Yep, you're right. So up north, higher latitudes, they're going to just be migrating down to like roughly where we are, Ohio, Kentucky, Pennsylvania area. Anything below there, so like that area, they're not going to move. They're going to stay in their, that breeding area. Sometimes they'll just kind of be adjacent to us, and then just stay in the exact same area all year round. But definitely short distance migrants. They're not all going to South America when it gets cold.
And what kind of maintenance needs to be done on the bluebird houses?
Sure. So I'm a bird person, so I don't really think of it as maintenance. It's your obligation, right? You gotta help these birds out. So kind of right before the nesting season starts, you would want to go in, you want to clean out your nest box. In Kentucky, kind of that Midwest area, you're thinking late February, early March, right before they actually start the nesting season, right before they're going to start building nests again. But you want to do it that late because they'll actually use those nest boxes over the winter. They'll actually go inside and perch, and that's, these nest boxes can be really important for their survival. This past February, we had that really bad cold snap. And a lot of people were reporting, finding 5 or 6 inside these nest boxes that had passed away because it just got too cold, or there probably wasn't enough of the fruits on the plants that were still around were frozen over. They couldn't actually eat. But by leaving that nesting material inside of the nest box, you're just providing a little bit more insulation, a little bit more warmth, so that they're not going to be quite as cold. But by actually taking it out before the nesting season, there's been studies that show that the bluebirds actually prefer a clean nest box going into the nesting season rather than have stuff, it's been sitting for a whole year that's probably full of different parasites and mites. So just by removing that, you're going to increase the likelihood of having a successful nest that season. Also, just year-to-year maintenance. Instead of sitting outside in the sun all year and the freezing, weather all year. So you're going to want to take your bluebird boxes to inspection. Maybe you look at it, repair any cracks, any holes that might decrease the weatherproofness of that box. If water's seeped into the box, those nestlings are going to get cold, they're going to get wet. They're not going to survive, or if they do survive, they may not be as well off in the future. Another thing, if you put a bluebird box up in your backyard on your property and you're just not having any luck attracting them, take that box, after like 2 years from not having birds, move it to someplace else on your property. You may have better luck somewhere else. And you may not get, eastern bluebirds. You might get tree swallows. You might get house wrens. All native birds, all very enjoyable to watch. Go in and out, raising young.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was going to ask too. Was are there other species that we might want in our nesting boxes that might be going to the bluebird boxes instead of the bluebirds, but not necessarily the starlings and stuff?
Yeah, so like I said, definitely tree swallows. If you have your box in your pond or something like that, you're gonna get tree swallows. And they're fun to watch as well, very brightly colored, that violet kind of green, beautiful. And you're also going to get house wrens most likely. They'll definitely use those bluebird boxes, especially if you kind of have an area where there's a lot more cover, a lot more shrubs, a lot more trees in that area. That's more likely to be the species that you're going to attract.
Okay. Yeah, tree swallows are absolutely gorgeous too. I like Carolina wrens better than house wrens, but wrens are just fun no matter what species they are. They've got so much personality.
A lot of energy, right? And if you ever look inside a box where a house wren's been, their nests are really interesting. I think of bluebirds, it's always grass, right? And these cup nests inside of cavities. You look inside of a house wren box, or a box that a house wren's inhabiting, and it's just sticks. It's just funny, this little bird, much smaller than a bluebird, is taking all this time to carry this much heavier nesting material and just building these elaborate stick nests. It's just really interesting.
Yes. And predators. We've kind of mentioned a little bit, especially on the nesting side of things. But what are some of the important predators that we need to be aware of for eastern bluebirds?
Yeah, so definitely cats.
Mm-hmm.
Feral cats are a major threat to eastern bluebirds, especially because it's not hard to get inside a nest box when they're only 4 feet off the ground. Raccoons, possums. During my research, I had a big problem with snakes, able to get inside the nest boxes. Also, other birds. Birds eat birds. It's part of the codes, right? So like Cooper's hawks, just different raptors will definitely be predating on bluebirds.
Okay. You've done all that research, and I'm sure you've got some really good stories, because there's always fun stories when you're watching birds like that. What are some of your cool, fun stories about eastern bluebirds and things that you've seen them doing?
Yeah. So it's just something that I had no idea that they did, which was just, it kind of blew me away. And it took me a day to kind of just figure out, oh, this is actually normal. It's just kind of rare. So eastern bluebirds, if you think like a robin, there's robin egg blue, right? Eastern bluebirds have that blue egg as well. It's very vibrant, very, very pretty. It was probably within my first brood of the breeding season that I was checking. And I came across an eastern bluebird nest. And it's definitely an eastern bluebird nest. I've seen the parents, but I look inside and these eggs are just stark white. It's just that something's off here. So I had to do a little research, and I actually came across, less than 2% of eastern bluebird eggs are white. And it seems to be one of those things where it's something that the female, some gene the female carries, that all of her eggs are going to be white. So just was different. Yeah, it was. It was just different for me, and it was cool. And then, did a little bit more digging, and sometimes they're not even white, they're actually pink. And, that's less than 1% that actually happens. I never came across it, but it does happen. Someone did some research into it, and it actually turns out there's a hypothesis that maybe these different colored eggs might help detect the presence of parasitic eggs in your nest. Where if I'm laying all white eggs, maybe if another eastern bluebird female is trying to sneak an egg into my nest, which happens every once in a while, and she lays this vibrant blue egg, I'm going to recognize that right away. But after the study was over, they couldn't actually come to the conclusion that said, this is true. So we're still kind of at a loss. It seems just one of those things where it happened. There wasn't a reason for it. There's no evolutionary advantage of having white eggs and blue eggs. It's just a cool thing that happened.
Yeah, that is interesting. Makes me almost wonder about fitness of the female.
Yeah, it could play some part into it. I don't think it's been well studied, to be honest with you. It's one of those just a random cool fact about. I also came across something that I found was interesting. I didn't know about this either. Was that we think of bluebirds as they're always cavity nesting species. And apparently that's not always been the case. Even historically, kind of you think about ancestrally, where you have these habitats where you probably had a lot of bluebirds, but there was a limited number of cavities that they could take advantage of. I think it was longleaf pine savannas where, there were enough cavities. So they actually would create like an open cup nest. I think you would think most birds, like robin's nest, just to give an example. And then I came across a paper that was actually published in the Kentucky Warbler in the, I think it was the 70s, in 1976. It was a strip mine out in eastern Kentucky in Breathitt County. And this gentleman, his name was Pierre Allier, was doing research on bluebirds out there. And he came across a bunch of nests just because they're, that were actually open cups. They weren't actually in cavities. Just there were no trees, no good cavities for the nesting. Just so in a sense, if there aren't the cavities, nature finds a way, right? They're gonna find a way to create nests so they can lay eggs and have, pass on their genes.
That is interesting. Yeah, because I didn't realize that they would sometimes do those, like you said, open cup nests. I thought they were always cavity nesters.
Yeah, I think the rule is that they're always cavity nesters until there's not any cavities.
Okay. Yep. They always are until they aren't.
Exactly. Yeah. That's how it goes with anything biologically speaking.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking. Yeah. Yes, I've been in this field way too long not to recognize the irony and the truth of that.
Or no surprises.
Yeah. Well, this has been interesting, and I really liked hearing about some of your research too and the provisioning rates with the males because, like I said, I like the nesting behaviors and everything associated with those interactions between the parents with other birds and then with the nestlings themselves. I think that's really an interesting field of study and one that I've always thought was fun to learn about.
Yeah, I had a great time learning about it.
But yeah, I mean, if you don't have anything else you want to share with us, I'll just say thanks a lot.
Yeah, I think we covered it all, Shannon. I had a great time. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being on there. Oh, if people have questions about eastern bluebirds, can they contact you?
Yeah, most definitely. I think you have my email in the show notes,
Yes.
But they can send me an email. It's michael.patton@ky.gov. And it's not just bluebirds, anything bird related is fair game.
Sounds great. Yes. And like I said, I will definitely have your contact information in the show notes. And then you also sent me some resources that I will include different links to other websites and stuff in the show notes as well for people who want to learn more and go a little bit further into this. Yeah. But yeah, thanks a lot and have a great day.
All right. Thanks for having me, Shannon.
Right, bye-bye. I appreciate Michael taking time out of his busy schedule to talk with us about eastern bluebirds and to share his research with us. Not only did I find his research interesting, but I also enjoyed learning more about this species in general. The idea that bluebirds will sometimes create open cup nests instead of nesting in a cavity was completely new to me. I also really appreciated Michael sharing so many tips for attracting bluebirds to our properties. I liked how he didn't jump straight to put up a bluebird house, but instead he took a big picture view that covered everything from the overall type of habitat they need, to the different types of food they need throughout the year, and of course the cavities that provide the bluebird nesting sites. I was also happy to hear him provide natural options, such as planting native plants that will bring in the insects that the bluebirds need, or leaving standing dead trees for natural cavities when possible, in addition to the more artificial alternatives of offering mealworms or putting up a bluebird house. I'm a big fan of the more natural options, but I think both options can be valuable. Before I wrap this up, I wanted to let you know about my email list, where I send short emails with links to the most recent Backyard Ecology blog articles and podcast episodes, as well as any other news of interest. It's the best way to make sure that you never miss anything in the Backyard Ecology world. If you haven't signed up, then I encourage you to do so at www.backyardecology.net/subscribe. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.